Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I am so delighted today to have Bruce Feiler as our guest. I totally love his book, and I know many of you who are friends and colleagues of mine as well as clients who are on this call know because I have been recommending his book to everybody because I just think it's terrific. And I want to introduce Bruce. I think I'll introduce him first and then kind of make that comment. But Bruce is one of America's most thoughtful voices on contemporary life. He's the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, the presenter of 2 primetime series on PBS, and the inspiration for the drama Council of Dads, which was on NBC. His work truly does combine timeless wisdom with timely knowledge turned into practical, positive messages that allow people to live with more meaning, passion, and joy. His new book, Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age, describes his journey across America, collecting hundreds of life stories and exploring how we can navigate the growing number of life transitions with greater purpose and skill. He's written for numerous publications, including The New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, Gourmet, and he won the James Beard Awards 3 times. He's a frequent commentator on radio and television, a former circus clown, and he's been the subject of a Jay Leno joke and a Jeopardy question. And his face appears on a postage stamp in the Grenadines. He's a native of Savannah, Georgia, and now lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Linda Rottenberg, and their identical twin daughters. And I'm so delighted that you're with us today, Bruce. I actually was aware of Bruce through his books and the PBS special, and then a dear friend of mine is a dear friend of his mother-in-law. And then when I saw this new book, Life is in the Transitions, and took a look at it, I contacted my friend and contacted his mother-in-law and was able to get to Bruce that way. So I am so delighted that my friend Olivia Mellon knows and is good friends with your mother-in-law that enabled this all to happen. And I just want to comment before we start the interview that I for 50 plus years in my clinical work with people in transition and life stories, and your book just so resonated with me because you've got such a beautiful framework that I think expands on sort of an understanding about the paradigm shift in life, which is all about the nonlinear life, and about, transitions and how we make meaning of our life, and it's wonderful. I mean, I truly can't give it enough accolades. So I would like us to start, and Bruce, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, nice to be with you, and greetings, everyone, from wherever you're joining. And what a kind and thoughtful introduction. And I'm always, even in a book like this that has reached a lot of people, the bestseller, et cetera, it's still, in its own way, to me, moving and charming and surprising when the book finds its way into the homes and arms and hearts of people who really need it. And I'm delighted that it's helped you and your clients.
Well, I think it's terrific. So why don't we start with you just telling us what led you to write this book? Because, right now I know we're in the midst of a lifequake, one of the terms you have, which hopefully during this time you'll explain. But I know you started this book a while ago, and you've shared some really personal, in the book you share some of the personal stories. So why don't you share, if you would, to the listeners who are from, I should say, they're from all over this country as well as parts of Europe. And so why did you write this book, and how did you approach this whole life story project?
Well, as you say, we are in a lifequake now, and I use that term, lifequake, coined that term in effect because it's this kind of massive period of change that we go through, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, kind of more often than we expect, and we are in one now. But I got interested in this topic because I went through one a few years back and didn't really have a language to describe it, and didn't really have a way of processing it. So since you've invoked my family, I will start with my family. So I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and I left the South in the 80s, went north to Yale, then went to Japan, where I started writing letters home on crinkly airmail paper. That dates me, but perhaps others on this call remember those days. And when I got back to Georgia 6 months later, everyone said of these letters I had written home, like, how much they enjoyed them. And I was like, great. Have we met? And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, and they went sort of viral in an old-fashioned sense of the word. And I thought, well, I should write a book about this. I didn't know anyone who'd written a book, but I sold my first book 32 years ago. And in my 20s, I wrote books, as you know, about Japan and England and country music. You mentioned my life as a circus clown.
Yeah.
In my 30s, I went back and forth to the Middle East writing books about the Bible and religion and spirituality and walking the Bible, spent a year and a half on the bestseller list. I made a bunch of television about that. And in the context of the conversation we're about to have, I think of that now as a sort of linear life. Like, this was the fantasy that we all hope for. Like, I figured out what I wanted to do. I did it for no money. I had some success. I got married. We had children. But then in my 40s, I was just completely upended by life. My life just took this massive nonlinear turn. First, at 43, I got cancer. At the time, I was a new dad of 3-year-old identical girls. That was 2008. I almost went bankrupt in the last recession. My family owned a bunch of real estate in Georgia. And then my dad, who has Parkinson's, got very depressed and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. So this was a crisis in sort of every way imaginable. And for a long time, I didn't want to tell this story, but when I did, it turned out that everybody else had a story about how their life was upended at some point or another, right? Medical crisis or financial crisis or a diagnosis or an addiction or whatever it might be. And what I realized, and now we get to sort of what you're talking about, this framework, and what I realized is that nobody knew how to tell their life story anymore. Like, what happens when we lose the plot of our own lives? And so that's what prompted me to just go and do something simple, like, let me just sit down with people and say, tell me the story of your life. And so I did that. I collected what became, you alluded to this, hundreds of life stories of Americans of all ages, all walks of life, all 50 states. People who lost homes, lost limbs, changed careers, changed religions, got sober, got out of bad marriages. And what happened was, and all of this talk about transitions and life quakes and all this stuff that became the book, I wasn't looking for that. I was just basically like, tell me the story of your life. But certain patterns just became clear the more I talked to people. And so I sort of did something I had never done before, which is I ultimately got a team of 12 people, and we spent a year combing through these stories, looking for patterns and takeaways that could help all of us when we reach these times of change.
And so and there was one other part that you mentioned that I just would love you to mention, too, about having your father write stories that really changed his life around. If you could mention that, too, and then we'll get to what you patterns.
So what I learned, right. So the backstory here is that I had spent, at the time all this was happening, right, in the kind of the 20-teens, I was writing a column for the New York Times about contemporary families, and I was working on a book in the early 2010s called The Secrets of Happy Families, when I went out and looked for sort of what do high-functioning families have in common. And as I was working on that book, the most interesting, and I knew it the second I heard it, and the most interesting idea I encountered was from a couple of researchers at Emory named Marshall Duke and Robin Fivish. And the idea was that children who know more about their family history were better able to navigate the ups and downs in their lives. It was the number one predictor of a child's emotional well-being. And if anybody listens to us, that research is written about in Happy Families. I wrote about it in the New York Times in an article called The Stories That Bind Us, and it went just crazy viral in the contemporary sense of the word. And this was in the spring of 2013, and it was that fall that my father went through this suicide spree, if you will. And so I had this idea like, maybe storytelling, maybe revisiting his own life story could be helpful to my dad. And so I started sending him an email every Monday morning with a question. tell me about the toys you played with. Tell me about, the house you grew up in. How did you become an Eagle Scout? How did you join the Navy? How did you meet Mom? And this man who had never written anything longer than a memo backed into writing an autobiography. And it made me realize that this storytelling has, I don't know, a clinical, a medicinal, certainly a restorative, exactly, impact on people. And it sort of allowed me, because I had suddenly was sort of known around the world as this sort of storytelling person, and I was being invited into all these venues, corporations and schools and nonprofits to talk about the power of storytelling. And I realized there was this whole field called narrative gerontology then there was a field called narrative adolescence and narrative medicine. And so storytelling was sort of in my head at the time, so that when I started hearing from everybody else that they had a problem, that's when I realized that in effect these life quakes, as I came to call them, we'll get to that in a second, is that any of these disruptions that we go through in our lives, that they are fundamentally narrative events. Like we have a story that we're telling about who we are, and then suddenly, boom, right? There's a diagnosis, there's a tornado, there's a pandemic. And the story that we're telling has disrupted, interrupted, overturned in some way, and that kind of narrative rupture demands a narrative solution.
So, and you illustrate it beautifully with the stories you tell, but part of what we'll get to even more toward the end is that Bruce has sort of some ways of dealing with transitions and really the rewriting of our story, because our story is our life, and the telling it and writing it is such a healing part. But tell me a little of what you learned with all the coding and when you've come up with these terms, disruptors, the voluntary, involuntary, pile-ups, life quakes. I love the terms and the imagery, so maybe you can just share that with some examples as you go along, because there's such richness to it.
Well, I appreciate that. And so again, let's reset the stage. So what I have is of life stories. I have 1,000 hours of interviews. We spend all this time coding. And so the big idea that emerges from all of this work is, I'd say threefold. Number one, the linear life is dead, okay? So what is the linear life? The linear life is the idea that we're going to have one job, one relationship, one sexuality, one spirituality, one source of happiness from adolescence to assisted living. And it's important to note that is absolutely how people talked about life in the 20th century, right? So if I can just do a brief detour, because this was sort of a revelation to me. And the kind of the revelation was that how we look at the world, specifically actually how we look at the world economically, affects how we look at our own lives. So in the ancient world, they don't have linear time, right? There's no clocks, there's no watches. So they think that life follows a cycle because that's what the agricultural calendar does, right? To every season, turn. In the Middle Ages, the Bible, in the West has introduced the idea of linear time. And so they think of life as a staircase up to middle age, and then you peak in middle, and then it's a staircase down from there. So what does that mean? That means no new love at 40, right? No starting a new venture at 50. No retiring in 60 and moving to Florida and opening a B&B or an Airbnb. Like straight up and then straight down. And it's especially worth noting that that's the opposite of how we were all told in the 20th century, that life bottoms out in middle age and then climbs up, right? So that idea gets introduced essentially in the middle of the 19th century when progress gets introduced in science, the idea that life is going to follow a kind of a linear ascent model. And, anybody here who's took any Psych 101 class in college was told, right, Piaget, that children have development, or Freud with the psychosexual stages of development, or Erikson with the 8 stages of moral development, the 5 stages of grief, the hero's journey, one after the other. These are all linear models, and this reaches its peak with Gail Sheehy in the 70s, who publishes his book Passages that, many people in this call will have heard of or read, or they're read, or whatever it was. And that book says everybody does the same thing in their 20s. everyone does the same thing in their 30s, and then everybody has a midlife crisis between 39 and 44 and a half. I mean, it's so rigid, Dorian. It's sort of, and it's just like became truth. Well, that's not how we look at the world anymore. That's just bunk, and that's a polite word for it. Because now we know that life is, has chaos theory, and there's the network effect and complexity. So the linear life is dead, and it's been replaced by, as you said, what I call the nonlinear life. And that involves many, many more changes in general, transitions in particular. So yes, my research shows that we go through 36 what I call disruptors in the course of our lives. That's one every 12 to 18 months. And that could be something as small as twisting your ankle and being on crutches for a few weeks, a fender bender, to as large as, getting sober after a long period of addiction, losing a loved one, losing your legs in a biking accident north of Grand Rapids to somebody that I spoke to. And most of us we get through pretty well. We actually are pretty adept at handling change. But 1 in 10 of those becomes a much bigger sort of tsunami of change, and that's what I call a life quake. And I use that term quake very purposely, and I struggled and worked hard to come up with it because it's important to me that it be value neutral, right? So half of life quakes, 53%, are involuntary, right? So that would be a diagnosis, or your spouse cheats on you, or your house burns down, or some natural disaster, or whatever it might be. But 47% of life quakes are voluntary, right? You choose to change your beliefs or your political affiliation. You choose to start a new venture. You choose to cheat on your spouse, right? So that's almost like 50-50. But we go through these we go through 3 to 5 in a lifetime, and the average length is 5 years. That's the most common length and the average length. So if you think 3 to 5 in a lifetime, 4, 5, 6 years, that's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives we are spending in a transition. And so the big lesson, if the first one is the linear life is dead, the second one is the nonlinear life involves many more transitions. As you just suggested, the third idea is that transitions are a skill that we can and must master. In effect, this is a lifelong sport that no one's really teaching us how to play.
Absolutely true. And you also talk about transitions being nonlinear. But before we get to that part, you have a section in your book that I really love, and all kinds of stories about the way we give meaning to our life, and the ABCs of it in terms of how we deal with these disruptions and life quakes. So could you share some of that? Because again, I think it just is part of the underpinnings of so much of what you're talking about.
So let's go back a century ago to the beginning of the 20th century. At that point, most of our sources of meaning were given to us. Okay? Mm-hmm. We had to live where our parents wanted us to live, do what our parents wanted us to do. This is especially true for women. Live where our parents wanted to live, do what our parents wanted us to do, believe what our parents wanted us to believe, love who our parents wanted us to love. I mean, these forms of meaning were prescribed and, kind of forced us by accident or blessing of birth. Well, 100 years later, that's just no longer true. We can live wherever we want. We can do whatever we want. We can believe whatever we want. We can love whomever we want. We can be sexually attracted and have sexual relations with anyone we want. We can even have the body that we want, which is something that seemed unimaginable to most people even a decade ago. And that is a great opportunity, but it's also incredibly perilous because we get paralyzed by choice, right? We get writer's block telling and writing the story of our own life. And so what was, kind of me moving, but hardest thing to tease out of these conversations was that we basically have kind of 3 building blocks that give us identity, kind of 3 primary stories that we tell ourselves. And I call these the ABCs of meaning. So the A is agency. That's what we do or make or build or create. For many of us, that's work lives. The B is belonging. belonging. So that's our relationships, our loved ones, our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, our co-religionists, whatever it might be. A is agency, B is belonging, and the C is a cause, a calling, something higher than ourselves. Kind of the way I think about this is that we all have all three of these within us. The kind of three stories, like your agency is your me story, your belonging is your we story, and your cause is your the story. But what happens is that what a lifequake is essentially a meaning vacuum, right? Where suddenly, when you think about the pandemic as kind of one that we've all been going through, suddenly the basic building blocks that we live our lives around, right? What we do being disrupted, right? Who we can see, our belonging totally changed. Our cause, like back, and yet there's a whole new set of causes that we now have to contend with and, choose whether we want to get involved or not in. And so lifequake is a meaning vacuum, but what a life transition is what actually recreates. It's sort of the factory, if you will, or the forge that builds the new meaning. So that what happens in a lifequake is that we adjust. Okay, so maybe you've been agentic. Maybe you've been working your whole life and now you want to spend more time with your family. That's a shift, in effect, from A being more important to B being more important. Maybe you've been a caretaker. Maybe you've been raising children or caring for an aging relative. And maybe you burn out and you want to do something for yourself. That's a shift from B to A. Or maybe you've been a volunteer and you've just burned out from that, right? You've been giving and you want to, write a memoir or, travel with your own family. So I call this kind of shape shifting. So what happens in a life transition is that because the basic building blocks of what give us meaning have been upended, it actually gives us a time to revisit these ABCs and decide if we want to shift. I mean, sort of imagine, if you will, these ABCs being like Lady Justice, but instead of having like two or three, there's like pebbles in each dish, and you kind of rebalance the various pebbles to make sure that the dishes are weighted in the way you want to be living right now.
And it sounds like what you've learned, and what you also talk about in the book, is that we really can choose how we put the meaning, and we can change the shape, as you're saying. And maybe this is a good time to get into what you mean by transition, because I know you've expanded on the more traditional view of it and named it, somewhat differently too. Can you tell us about the nonlinear kind of transition and some of the ways, the stories that you've learned of how people have dealt with it? I know you've come up with about 7 tools that people can use with transition. So maybe this is a time to just kind of mention that, and then we can get more into some of the stories too.
So you've gone through a lifequake, right? So you're sort of on your heels, is the way I like to think about it, right? And then the transition is what's going to put you back on your toes, right? But what happens is, I'd love to see a kind of a show of hands, but I guess we can't do that on this call. But there tend to be 2 types of people when you go through a lifequake. Okay, one type is, I'm going to make a 212-item to-do list, and I'm going to get through this weekend, and I'm going to be the gold medal winner, the blue ribbon winner, and the all-around trophy champion, and I'm going to, nail this thing in 4 days. The second type of person is under the blanket with the cat in the fetal position on the bed saying, I'm the only one this has ever happened to. I'm never going to get through this, and woe is me. Well, in effect, both of those are wrong. I mean, and you look at enough of these events, life events, and certain patterns begin to appear. So a couple of things. So thing number one is that the lifequake itself can be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition must be voluntary. Like, you need to lean in, choose to go through the steps and the phases and the tools, as you say, and get through it. And that's actually a sort of a big step that often we overlook, because, as I just said, some people are ready on day one to transition, and some people are like, I'm not ready yet. I just have to absorb the blow. But then when you go through it, okay, so what can we learn about these patterns? So I think thing number one is that life transitions have 3 phases. And these 3 phases are, my names for them are the long goodbye, where you sort of confront that it's an emotional experience and use rituals to sort of mark and demarcate the fact that you're going through a transition. So that's the long goodbye. The second phase is the messy middle, That's for those coming up on Passover, like that's the Israelites wandering in the desert, right? So that's where you have to shed certain habits and create new ones. And then the last one is the new beginning, where you sort of unveil your new self and kind of update your story. But you alluded to this earlier, so I'll double back and say that for the first century of thinking about transitions, and I'll just say that, we can just geek out on the science or history for a second. The idea of a transition was sort of, invented, sort of first understood and described a century ago by a German anthropologist named Arnold van Gennep, who actually invented the phrase rites of passage. So his translator said it should be rites of transition. And he said, and everybody else, like the last major book on transitions was 40 years ago, William Bridges, as you know, like everybody said that you must go through these sort of phases, even though my understanding and names for them are different than everybody else. But you must go through these chronologically, like first you must say goodbye, and then you must go through the messy middle, and then you must go to the new beginning. And in fact, Van Gennep describes it as leaving one room, going down a hallway, then entering another room. That's incredibly vivid. Like, I totally get it, and it's totally wrong. It's like not how people do it. I mean, imagine somebody getting divorced. Like, you may be in a relationship. Well, maybe somebody has started an affair with somebody new. It's like they're already in the new room and they still haven't gotten out of the old room, right? Or often people will leave one room and go into the hallway and like, whoop, not ready for that yet. And they go back to the original room, and then they want to go peek in the new room. Do they like it? So the point is that people do these phases out of order, and that's totally fine. Not only is it totally fine, I would even argue that it's preferred, right? Because everybody in these phases, everyone has a superpower. Like some people are good at saying goodbye, right? They turn the page. I'm just not going to take that stuff from you, and I'm going to leave, right? Okay, you know what? I have a diagnosis. I accept it. Give me the doctors. Give me the to-do list. I want to attack it. Some people are just good at that. Some people are awful at it. They're a people pleaser. They're conflict averse. They stick around in a relationship too long, or they, stay around for a boss that's toxic, and because they're afraid of will they ever get a job again. So different people have different strengths and weaknesses, and sort of one of my kind of very strong convictions is, find what you're good at. If you're good at the to-do list and, dealing with the ambiguity and problems, start there. If you are good at that, odds are you're not so good at accepting that you're scared, right? Or you're sad, or you need to mourn, or you need to grieve, or you need to dispense with your anger in some way. But start with what you're good at, work your way to what you're bad at. It's going to be hard no matter what, so you might as well build some confidence at the very beginning.
That's such good advice. And what can you just say more about some of the emotions that you found in the stories of, because I think there's just a range of emotions that some people experience in transitions, and I think you speak to that. Can you?
I'm happy to talk about that, because to me it was such a kind of arresting part. I just sort of started listening to people and started asking this question. And so I looked hundreds of people in the eye and I said, what's the biggest emotion that you struggle with during your time of transition? The most common answer? Fear. I'm afraid. How am I going to live without this job? How am I going to survive without this loved one? What am I going to do without my legs? Or in the case of Zach Herrick, of black man adopted by a white family in Kansas who ended up in the Taliban and ended up in Afghanistan and had his face shot off by the Taliban, 31 surgeries between the tip of his nose and the tip of his chin. How am I going to live without a face, right? How am I ever going to find love again? People are afraid. That's the first emotion. The second emotion is sadness. I miss this person. I liked having that job. I liked being able to see my grandchildren. I liked going into the office. I liked, the confidence, the status I had from whatever phase of life I was in. So just sadness, grief. And the third, which is actually a little surprising to me, was I'm ashamed that I need help. I'm ashamed of what I did when I was addicted. I'm ashamed that my child has an anxiety disorder and had to drop out of college. So many people I know, because I'm of that demographic, have. The kids struggle when they get to college, and something simple like running into someone at the supermarket and how are the kids is a shameful experience for many people. So then I asked, so how did you manage or navigate or tame these emotions? And this was interesting because some people like write their feelings down, and that's how a lot of people react. Some people do kind of what I would do in a difficult situation, which is like buckle down, like go back to work, pour yourself into something with a lot of energy so you don't have to deal with your emotions. But 80% of people use rituals in some way. They dig a hole and bury something in the backyard. They light a candle. They go to a sweat lodge. I mean, I talked to a woman, Lisa Ray Rosenberg, who had an awful year. She went on 52 first dates. She actually even made a spreadsheet of everything she wore on the first date because she only went on 8 second dates, and she didn't want to wear on a second date what she had worn on the first date. She couldn't remember them all. She had a falling out with her mother. She was a donor. By the way, I'm talking to you from Brooklyn. They're doing some street work, so apologies if you're hearing some urban life. And so then she was a bone marrow donor to her brother. And she said, this just isn't working. And I'm afraid, like, am I going to find happiness? What was her biggest fear? Heights. So she jumped out of an airplane. A year later, she was married with a child. So there's something about these rituals, their way to say to, I don't know, ourselves or others or both in some combination. I'm going through a challenging time. I'm going to get through it, but it's like a signifier, like, I don't know, like the old baby on board. I'm dating myself again. The old baby on board thing from the 80s, whenever that was popular, the 80s or 90s or whenever that was, sort of like, transition on board. This is me going through a transition. Be a little tender. Thank you very much. Having not said that, I wish that was my book. See, this is the thing about. I always say we should talk about the book before we publish it. Like, I now wish the baby on board thing or in life is in the transitions.
But you've just shared it, so it's
I just literally just came up with it off the top of my head, and now I'm like, dang, I missed opportunity.
You've got so many opportunities in that book, and it's got me thinking of so many. But what are some of the ways that you have found, and maybe add some stories of the steps, the tools that people, that you found that people were using or could use to kind of reshape their life and change their story? It's sort of the toolkit of transition. So, right.
So we've been talking about some of them. So there's 7 tools.
Yeah.
The first one is accept it, right? Accept that it's an emotional experience, and label the emotions that you're going through, which is very powerful. The second is mark it, right? That's the rituals that we were just talking about, and those are basically associated with the long goodbye part of the transition. Moving to the messy middle, there are kind of 2 there. One is shed it, like identify habits about. And some of the habits that you shed are ones that you like, I used to be able to spend more money when I had a bigger salary, or, I used to be able to walk and now I'm on crutches as I was for 2 years, or other things that you liked being with a loved one who's now deceased or is no longer there because there's a, separation or estrangement or divorce or whatever it might be. But a lot of what people shed, I talked to a woman, Lee Wintz, in Virginia, who went through a difficult year. She had cancer. She ended her marriage, and she said, she had yo-yo dieted all of her life, and so the thing that she had to shed was something that she didn't like about herself, which was her habit of every time she walked in the door, opening the fridge and pulling out something to eat. And she finally lost 60 pounds, and she's kept it off. So shedding is a big part of it. But why do we shed? We shed because we need to make room for what is the next tool, which is just this, just beautiful part of a life transition, which is these astonishing acts of creativity that people participate in. And when I mean creativity, I don't mean like thinking, I mean like actual creativity, like dancing. I talked to a woman in Florida, Helen Kim, who also had cancer. Her husband was not a good caretaker. She left him, and she retired from teaching chemistry at a university in Alabama. And she's like, you know what? My whole life, when I was a child, I wanted to be a ballerina. So she started taking adult ballet. Like people, I talked to a scholar academic psychologist in Arkansas who was caught up in a faculty scandal and lost her job. She started painting birdhouses. Zach Herrick, that wonderful, incredible Army veteran I spoke about earlier, he was like on the brink of suicide and depressed. He had, as I said, 31 surgeries on his face, including having his tongue sewn back on. And his mother moved to Virginia to be with him in his rehab process, and she said, well, you should start cooking. So because his tastes had changed because of, all the trauma to his mouth. So he starts baking and cooking and barbecuing, and he's like, the girls all loved it, right? Because remember, he was worried about dating. I said that. Then he starts writing poetry, and then he starts painting, splattering paint on the canvas. He's like, like that guy, Jackson Pollock, like him. I'm like, wait a minute, hold on a second, Zach. If I told your high school football playing self in Kansas that you were cooking and writing poetry and, splattering paint on the canvas, he would say, I would have thought it was stupid. But I used to get out my aggression by splattering the Taliban with bullets, and now I get out my aggression by splattering paint on the canvas. And he's had art shows in local galleries in Virginia. So people turn to astonishing acts of creativity. And just another word about the pandemic, if you think back like almost exactly a year ago, what was the number one cliche? The number one cliche. And when the pandemic first hit, what did everybody do? They baked, right? We're going to sourdough our way through this. And I may have been the only person in America who was not surprised by this, because that little act of imagining, that little act of creativity, like imagining that loaf of bread, gets you out from under the covers with the cat, right? Slows you down from the 222 item to-do list. You get your hands messy, you create something, you eat it. And that act of creativity allows you to imagine that in the same way you can create that loaf of bread, you can create a new self.
It's such a beautiful example. I mean, it's like giving oneself permission to be and to, become unstuck. But as you say, it's got to be something you choose to do and not judge yourself on it, but just do it and allow yourself to express it.
Look at what's the Bible references if I can. How did God create the world? It's with words, right? It's a simple act of creativity. And you look at any tradition, and you look at whether it's the Hebrew Bible in the wilderness I mentioned, the New Testament with Jesus going, off into the desert, or Paul on the road to Damascus, right? The Hindus go into the forest. Muhammad goes into the desert. What does Jason do? Hercules do? Orpheus do? The greatest, oldest, most enduring stories involve people leaving a state that's comfortable and going on some journey that involves discomfort in order to create a new self. This is the story that has been told as long as we have been telling stories.
That's so true, so true. And then your next one is the sharing it. So what's involved with that?
Well, it's interesting, so these tools, as I said, so just to reset the stage here, you've got life quakes that send us into life transitions. These transitions have three phases: going goodbye, the messy middle, the new beginning, and these 7 tools. And I should say, by the way, that everybody's naturally good at some of these tools, but nobody does them all. Everybody kind of wants to get better at it, but nobody really knows where to ask. And that's, I would say, now that this book has been out, Life Isn't a Transition has been out in the world for 6 months, I would say the biggest reaction to it, and this is, apologize for using jargon, but the most common reaction, I just feel better, you're putting a name to these feelings that I have that I didn't really know what to do with. So
and I'm not alone tools, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not alone. I just feel, because that's what you feel when you go through life. You just feel alone, and you feel other, and that tends you in your head. And by the way, all the studies of creativity for decades have shown that the correlation between kind of creativity and aloneness is very high. People who feel different or other or separate or often create the greatest art, because it's those who are sort of in the mainstream, feeling welcome, are, popular, successful. Those people, it's working for them. Right? It's the people who have a slightly different point of view that are sort of slightly outside of it who tend to be the more creative. But you mentioned share it. So most of these tools are associated with one of these phases. So there are 2 with a long goodbye, there's 2 in the messy middle, there's 2 in the new beginning. But one of them is not associated because it sort of floats. It either happens all the time in all phases, or at one particular time, and that is share it. So what we just were saying, we're talking about how everybody who goes through this feels apart, other, separate in some way, shape, or form. And that's dangerous. It leads to creativity, but it leads to loneliness and despair and anxiety and depression. So don't go through it alone. But one of the interesting things that I didn't really expect, what happened was I was talking to this woman, Helen, who just went through a very difficult year where it was like a 1 or 2 year period where she lost both of her parents. She expected to take over this business that she was the vice president of, and she was overlooked. And so she was just spiraling a bit. And she told me that she was out with a friend and kind of talking to her friend, and that her friend basically said at one point or another, like, you're just whining again. I'm tired of hearing you whine, like, get over yourself. And she said that her friend slapped her, metaphorically, but slapped her like Cher does to Nicolas Cage in Moonstruck. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that is such an insight. And so then I sort of went back and I coded it backwards, and then I started asking everybody, like, what kind of advice do you like when you're going through a difficult time? And it was kind of interesting, right? So some people like comforters, like, I love you, Dory, you'll get through it, I believe in you, like, soldier on. Some people like nudgers, like, I love you, Dory, but, maybe you should do this. Like, maybe you should couch and go out of the house. Like, maybe you should go on Match.com and start dating, or whatever the kids do to date these days. Or maybe you should go to LinkedIn and post your resume. Or maybe you should go, like, try AA, or whatever it might be. And, like, so there's comforters, there's nudgers, and then there's slappers. Like, I love you, Dory, but, like, get over yourself. Like, you have been wallowing in this, and it's really time to, get dressed, like, take off the sweatpants, put on the blue jeans, stroll out of the house, and go do something about this problem that you've just been wallowing in or complaining about for a long period of time. And then there's another kind, which is a modeler. So a model, I think, will be poignant to anybody. Like me, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. Like, that was an isolated place when I was growing up there in the 70s and the 80s. Like, and so particularly for people who might have been LGBTQ, like a number of transgender people I spoke to had this experience, like they identified a public role model who they followed because they didn't personally know anybody in northern Alabama who might have been gay, or who in their particular family who had a drinking problem because no one else did, or a financial problem. So they sometimes the person that they feel this kinship with, or is kind of a guide or a spirit animal or whatever people call it these days, is a public person who gives them inspiration in some way. But the point is, don't go it alone. Like, get somebody to accompany you through whatever transition you're going through.
Really, really good advice, because it can be so isolating. And I think sometimes, it's both good to go inward, but not to get stuck inward without then being able to sort of know you're not alone and I think the idea of a guide is a really helpful thing, or somebody that you can learn from, so that you don't get restuck, I guess.
Right. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. It's sort of like getting restuck, or like getting in the same, like when you're trying to pull your car out of a ditch or whatever, and you back up and then you think you're free, and then you go back into the rut, and now it's deeper than it was right before. And I got a call. Right. I tell the story in the book. I got this call, I don't know, it's gone back a while now, a number of years ago, from a friend asked me to speak to a friend who was dealing with a major media company that I had dealt with, that I had some difficulty with. And so this person was in London, and they called me, and you mentioned my in-laws. I was actually on Cape Cod when I got this call. And so the person calls me. I tell my story of having tangled with this major media company, and then he tells his story, and 45 minutes has passed, and he's like, well, thank you very much. This was really wonderful. And I say, well, I don't really think I told you anything that was particularly helpful. I just told you my story, and you told me your story. And he said to me, oh, my grandmother used to always say that a story shared is a problem shared is a problem halved. And I have no idea if a lot of grandmothers say this, or if just this individual's grandmother said it. I've never heard it before, but I love it, and I think it's just deeply accurate. And when you look at the research, even people who go to group therapy. Mm-hmm. It's like the people who talk the most feel like they get the best out of it, most out of it. In fact, the people who talk the most in group therapy believe they get the most back from the group, even though they've been dominating the group. And it's just a reminder that just the act of, here we go again with the storytelling, just the act of telling your story is in and of itself, medicinal, curative, restorative, transition promoting-ative in its own way.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's very, very healing. Very, very healing. So are there other of the steps of transitions? And then I want to start integrating some questions from people on the call.
Right. Well, I'll say yes. I mean, I think that the last one is in some ways the most important, which is the rewriting of the story, right? If you go back to what we were talking earlier, like at its very essence, a lifequake is a narrative event, right? It's a rupture in the narrative. So it needs a narrative solution. And I love this sort of forgotten academic phrase from the 1980s called an autobiographical occasion, right? So it's an autobiographical occasion when we are called on to kind of revisit and rewrite and retell our life story. And sort of the essence of that is basically to add a new chapter.
Right.
Like I was living my life, and this had happened to me, and this has happened to me, and then suddenly there was a pandemic, and, well, this is how I got through the pandemic, and this is what I learned, and this is what and this is what I created. And it's basically the essence of a life transition is adding adding a chapter to your ongoing life story, making sure that even though there will have been pain and difficulty and loss and et cetera, inevitably involve some type of learning or upbeat or happy ending or lesson learned or something, some sort of growth can come out of it. And I think that that's kind of fundamentally the way to think about it. Is it's writing a new chapter to your story, integrating that chapter into your story, and then you kind of know you're through it when you can finally begin telling that story, not just to yourself, but to those around you.
I think that's so important, too. I've often used a different way of thinking about it, but just that they're stories we tell ourselves, and often they hinder us. And in a sense, by the writing a new chapter and integrating the lifequake or the disruptors or probably the combination, we're able to still hold on to the who we are, but how we've grown, how we become our own hero in a sense, or how we've forged ahead, which is so empowering.
You publish a book, we're talking about a book of mine, obviously, Life is in the Transitions. And you publish a book, it goes into the Library of Congress, right? You can tweak this or tweak that or correct a mistake or two or whatever, maybe change a paragraph in the paperback, but it's pretty much done. Your life story is not done. You can change it at any time for any reason without asking anybody's permission. And frankly, you can even tell yourself a few mistruths to get through it. You can justify mistakes you might have made and warm them over. And, guess what? You have that power. You get to write your own story. And, yes, you make yourself the hero of your own story.
Right. Oh, it's wonderful. So let me start with a few questions here. So Mary from Ottawa just wondered, have you found any kind of gender differences, women being more financially challenged than men during transitions, maybe especially around, retirement and maybe following disasters like our kind of collective lifequake right now of the pandemic?
So, the short answer to your question is no. The medium answer is much less than I expected. And the longer answer is I was just wrong about a lot of this. I think that when I went into this, I believed that before getting to gender or age, which often comes up, so I'll go ahead and answer that question in case somebody else is thinking about it. I would say that I expected that there would be a different toolkit for handling a medical transition or a financial transition or the loss of a loved one transition or a natural disaster. That was just flat wrong. That these transitions have much more in common than I would have expected, which is why there's sort of a universal toolkit for how to navigating them. And as you've said a couple of times, I will say as people will encounter in the book, and I hope people will read it if it can be helpful, is I'm not wagging my finger and telling you what to do. I'm, in fact, introducing you to lots of other people and showing you this is what they did. Some of these will be irrelevant. Maybe you don't want to jump out of a plane, or maybe you don't need to learn to cook because you already know how to cook, but I have no doubt that there will be ideas in here that will be helpful in that thing as people read and share and discuss in groups and with their therapists, et cetera, this book. So point number one is it's generally the same no matter what type of life quake you're experiencing, okay? Now let's move to gender. So I think that I said the answer is no, there's not really gender differences. There are slight gender differences here or there, like, in the ABCs of meaning, there's the people who say that they're more belonging-oriented. That favored slightly women over men. Certainly in the pandemic, you said Ottawa, and I don't know the numbers in Canada, but certainly in the United States, we have seen more women, especially women with young children, kind of bearing the brunt of this, because obviously it's almost impossible to work when you have young children around. And so that's complicated. It's less true, I think, than it might have been 25 years ago. A, because more women are working. B, because more men are involved in parenting than before. But there's still been some gender disparity, so I think it would be inaccurate to say that there's none. But I would say much in general, in terms of the larger points that I'm making about accepting that it's emotional and, using rituals and shedding it, for example, shame. Often the literature will suggest that women feel shame more than men. That's a kind of I think Brene Brown talks about that. But that, my experience, that is not true. That the feelings are not gender normative in any way. I should say a word about age, because I just brought that up. And there I do think that there's a kind of an interesting subtle distinction, right, which is that I was born in 1964, so I'm nominally a baby boomer, even though that's 20 years after the war, which seems laughable. But in general, I would say that this idea that life is nonlinear, in terms of sort of embracing the idea that the linear life is dead and that we live nonlinear lives, I would say that Xers get that intuitively more than boomers, and millennials even more than Xers, and as Gen Zers, like my teenage kids keep reminding me as they come up, I think are going to be even more so than millennials. So there's an interesting kind of transition gap, right? Which is, I know a lot of kind of 50-plus parents who are sort of a little bit baffled and frustrated by their 20-something children. Like, what do you mean you're like getting... what do you mean you're having a baby before you get married? Or like, what do you mean you're like quitting your job when you don't have another job? Or what do you mean you're moving to a town and you don't know what you're going to do when you get there? Like, I think that in general, people who have come of age more recently understand that they're going to have 12.7 jobs and 11.4 moves and many more life changes. And whereas kind of people 50 plus are more haunted by what I call the ghost of linearity. Like, we all grew up with, those of us in that generation, those generations grew up much more implanted with the idea of linearity than young people today.
I think that's really true. I mean, I think my situation's even an example of that I always would say to people, I do life backwards, because I was 50 when I had my child. And, most of my friends were becoming grandparents then. So I always believed in the nonlinear life. I just didn't have the term for it. That's why I like your book, too. But I think, a lot of people on the call are older, and you're right. There's the ghost of the linear life, and then just sort of thinking about, we don't have to make excuses that we did things on our own terms, or you go back to school when you're 80, or you become an artist, when you're 70 or 80 or 90 or whatever.
You could have been alive in the Middle Ages when you were not allowed to. Yeah, I think that's right. Exactly right. I feel like, and I think that what we're hitting on is a source of a lot of anxiety that people have, which is that we have linear expectations but nonlinear lives. And then when we do things that are nonlinear and we feel called to do them, we often feel disconnected, not just from our own expectations, but from what we think others perceive in us.
Exactly. Yep.
But that's the problem, because the reality is even people who are linear, I go even one step further, and I do talk about this in the book, as you know, but even people who are linear in one aspect, like maybe you've had a long-standing relationship, but then likelihood, maybe you've changed, or you've waxed and waned in your beliefs, or you're interested in spirituality, or maybe you've had multiple jobs, or maybe you've moved a lot, or maybe you've had one job forever. Did I say one relationship? Whatever. So even people who, the point is, you get the point. You can do the math. But even if you're stable in one area, I'd almost say there's a 100% likelihood that you're more oscillating in another area, and even that creates confusion. But the reality is the oscillation, the nonlinearity, the periods of stability and periods of instability. That's how we now know the world works. That's the essence of chaos theory. That's the essence of network theory. That's, what's the foundational text of chaos theory, which is if a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, you get a tornado in Texas. Okay, you had literally a bat flap its wings in Wuhan 18 months ago, and now I can't see my grandchild in Florida. Like, we live in a networked world, and the change is coming from all directions.
It's really true. So Teresa from Amherst says, are all people equally good at developing and telling their new story when they get to the new beginning? How can we get better at it?
I think that all people are equally capable, but all people aren't necessarily equally good. But even the good people can get better. I think a lot of it is this echoes a theme that we've been coming back to. A lot of it is just putting a language that this is what you're doing. There hasn't been a major book on life transitions for 40 years. I think we've just sort of been distracted by lots of other things, whatever, grit and resilience. And I'm very grumpy about resilience because resilience is an echo of the linear age. In fact, the word resilience originally came from a spring, right? It's the idea of you pull a spring, and how far the spring springs back is how resilient it is. And that is, to me, that is like the classic linear mindset. Like, you get stretched and then you go, no. Some people are going to go back. We're going to, but some people are going to go sideways or a different way altogether, right? That's why storytelling is such a better way of looking at it, because the story can take you any direction that you want, and it's not back. We're not going back to pre-pandemic. Remember the beginning? We all thought, we'll mitigate. We'll stay inside for a month and we'll go back. We now know we're not going back. We're going to go to, even if we resume the things we were doing, we will be changed and the experiences will be different. We're going to be going to a new place. So some basic things about storytelling, how to get better at storytelling. Number one, use upbeat language. Okay? We now know that we're wired for stories. We know that we have mirror neurons. So, what's a mirror neuron? A mirror neuron is a part of your brain. If you were actually looking at me, but even listening to me, by the way, the same thing happens. If I say slow, bogged down, lethargic, enervated, exhausted, you begin to feel all those things. Like, your brain mimics what I'm saying. If you use up, higher, faster, growth, movement, excitement, forward, your mind recreates that. So when you tell these stories, make an effort to use upbeat language, not just downbeat language. And I'm not even writing these stories. I mean, even telling these stories. Second, have some distance. Like, when you tell a story, if you do it in present tense, it's like you relive it. Oh, right, I'm driving along, and then the truck comes, and then it hits me, and I feel myself crushed, and I know I'm never going to be able to walk again. That's a present tense version of that story, as opposed to, I was driving along, I had been having a bad day, I was hit, I felt myself being crushed, I felt I might never walk again. Then I went through 2 years of physical therapy, as for example I did, but not from my being crushed, but from having a tumor in my left femur. And then I was able to learn to walk again. That little act of using past tense creates a certain distance from the act and allows you to begin to mold it in some way into a different kind of story. So upbeat language, past tense, and then, find a happy ending. Find an affirmative ending. And people take positive events like, oh my God, I won this prize, but the money wasn't very much, and then I squandered it, and no one came to my mother didn't come to the ceremony, and I wasn't as happy as I wanted. You've now taken a positive event and given a downbeat ending. The opposite is my dad died. It was after a long illness. The family came together. He was able to write these stories. We were able to reconnect, and we decided to have a reunion every couple of years because we miss seeing our relatives. That's taking a downbeat story, but having an upbeat ending. So that's another trick that can make the stories more forward moving.
Great example. So Meredith from Florida says, do you think about life transition as a noun or a verb?
That's an interesting question. I think that, it's interesting. I mean, the word, I was sort of fascinated, about why transition had gone out of favor. Like, why is it something that people used to talk about and we write books about, but didn't? Then along came the pandemic, and we were all going through a transition together. So I think the transition, it's sort of this collective experience, has made us all much more conscious about it. I would want to be sensitive that the word transition as a verb does have a particular meaning now in the LGBTQ community.
Yep.
It's actually complicated when you and I did a number of transgender stories. There's a couple that appear in Life Transition, and I'm working on another book now about work stories, and I've been talking to a lot of transgender people recently. And so there's this transition, and there's detransition and retransition, and so it turns out that those journeys are nowhere near as linear as often the media portrays them to be. So I would just be just a tad sensitive that some people might feel that was, I don't know, transgressive in some way to start. But yes, I do think that you do transition, and so I think it is a verb, but I'm not sure that I find the verb all that satisfying. Like, I don't know, I feel like if I'm, if I've lost a loved one, am I transitioning to a state of acceptance? I don't know. That doesn't land well with me. Or do I feel like the pandemic, we have been transitioning our way? I don't know. I think it can be used as a verb. There's the sensitivity I just mentioned, and I just don't think it just doesn't land on my own word ear in the right way. That's an awkward phrase, but you get the point. So sure, if you like it, but I like it as a thing, and then I prefer these words of accepted and market and shedded and created and share it. I prefer those from my verbs.
Okay. And Dawn from Canada, I'm pulling together sort of from a number of different people, so there are just going to be a couple more questions. Dawn from Canada says, my whole family has recently been pushed into a collective series of life quakes by a long list of mostly involuntary changes. We're supportive of one another, but how might we align our transitions without overcomplicating things?
Well, let me just first of all mention because you mentioned this at the outset, Dory, I think, which is this has just simply never been written about in the social science literature, to my knowledge, which is that for whatever reason these things tend to clump. Right, so you say we've been pushed into like that is completely consistent with what I found in talking to people. And I used the word pile up as a way of capturing this phenomenon, because it just, and some of it's an accident, some of it is coincidence, like maybe what you've described. But I actually have come to believe that there's a little bit of correlation, like somehow it's almost as if a life quake, even one, kind of weakens our immune system, and so that along comes something that could be a disruptor, but it ticks over into a life quake just because of the timing. Like, just when you lose your job, your mother-in-law needs cataract surgery, or, just when your child has an anxiety disorder, you break a leg, right? So there's just something about them that seems to clump. So I want to just express my empathy that they're happening to you all at this time. I think that, I think that they are complex in the sense that they do involve multiple, these tools. They are emotional. They do involve shedding. They do involve, unveiling your new self. So to a certain extent, they are complicated, and I might just sort of give yourself a break and just acknowledge that it's difficult and they're complicated. But I think if I wanted to simplify to the heart of your question, I would say, you know what? I'd go back to these three phases, right? You know what? There's just different aspects of going through it. There's a goodbye period where you just sort of, you're mourning and you're sad and just saying, you know what, today I'm sad. Today I'm in the long goodbye. Then there's this messy middle, which involves activity, some shedding, some creativity, some sharing, and just say, you know what, I just feel like I'm in the messy middle. And there's a reason that is the messy middle. It's messy. You can get into the weeds of how it's, or the mud or the muck or why it's messy, but sometimes just saying, you know what, I just feel a messy middle today. I see that, I'm starting to see that on social media a lot. I just feel like I'm in the messy middle today. You know what? And everybody will get it. And then there's the new beginning, it's also a little scary. When I had cancer, it's like when you go through a treatment, it's like it's in an odd way. It's not comforting, but you don't have to make a lot of decisions. The doctor tells you to show up, you get a treatment, and then you have the reaction, and then you go for the next treatment. And for anyone who's gone through chemo, rehab, or a 12-step program, there's something very safe in the fact that there's a series of steps you're supposed to go through. And when those steps come to an end, it's scary. The new beginning is also scary in its own way.
I think that's true, and I think there have been a few questions that kind of highlight that too, about people venturing out now at the end of COVID. It's not quite the same as cancer, but it's similar, of people scared. It's scary to think about what is going to be the new beginning, and for each of us, it may be a little bit different in terms of our risk tolerance and in terms of what we've learned during this time.
Literally at this hour tomorrow, I was just invited to give a TED Talk and it's about this. It's about new beginnings. This is something I'll bring. And I've been thinking about new beginnings, and the odd thing about beginnings is that they often come at the end. Right? So here we are at the end of the pandemic, and we're facing a new beginning, and we feel inexperienced, and we're nervous about it, right? Actually, rituals, I think, are just in the way they're rituals when we go into these transitions. There's also rituals and coming out. So, yes, I think be tender, be respectful. There's also emotions about the new beginning and a new story. Not only has to be in your head, but has to be, what are you going to say when you sit down? We just had my in-laws here for the first time in 9 months with my kids over the weekend, right? What do you say to somebody? How was your pandemic? Right? Everyone's going to need a story.
That's so true.
Thank you all very much. What an honor to be with you. And I love these questions, and I'm so grateful.
How can people reach you? Go ahead.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah. So a couple things about that. So yes, I'm Bruce Feiler, which is Feiler. So I'm in certainly all the social medias and Facebook and Instagram, and I'm not on TikTok with my kids, but LinkedIn. If you go to brucefeiler.com, you can send me a question. Also, if you go to brucefeiler.com, I mentioned, and you were kind to ask about that, the storytelling project I did with my dad, where I sent him a question every Monday morning. If you're interested in that, or you have a loved one that you'd like to do a storytelling project, if you go to my website, there's a tic-tac-toe board on the homepage. Click on the yellow square in the middle, and there's a way I'll send you a question for a nominal fee every Monday for a year, and you can get a book at the end of it. And as I said, I'm always collecting stories. I'm doing a project now I call the Work Story Project, where I talk to people about their work lives. So if you've got a good work story to share or know someone who does, go to one of these outlets and reach out. And I'm grateful that this book has touched a nerve. I'm touched that people here have a way into these stories, and we'll get through this time together, everyone.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, Bruce. It's just been wonderful. So I really appreciate it. But Bruce, thank you so much, and stay well and safe as we enter this new beginning as people are getting more and more vaccinated.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.